Well, at the beginning of Lent, I noted that by this time in the season, I would be looking for excuses to stop giving it up for Lent. So it would be a good week for me to give up excuses. So that has been my Lenten challenge this week. And as has been true, every week since Lent began, it has been much more difficult and complicated than I expected. And the reason that it is more difficult and complicated is because excuses tap into the stories we tell ourselves. So not long ago, Vern May had an article in the Herald Leader where he challenged a popular excuse for lack of successful economic development in our community. We're too close to Winnipeg. But that's the story we tell ourselves, isn't it? It's part of how we see our community. And to stop using that as an excuse, we need to change the way we understand ourselves. I discovered this week that this is kind of true about all of our excuses, no matter how large or small. They're part of the story we tell ourselves and each other. They're ways that we cope with disappointment or things that don't match our expectations. Why we failed, why we forgot, why we couldn't, why we missed out. And when we wade into excuses territory, we're wading into areas where we are sensitive, where we're vulnerable, where we have trouble accepting or being really honest with ourselves. Challenging ourselves around these parts of our life has the interesting impact of inviting us to make excuses rather than to let it go. Think about it. Asking yourself, why didn't I go to the gym? Only makes you want to blame someone or find justification, doesn't it? Asking your child why they didn't walk the dog or why they kicked their brother only makes them want to come up with some sort of reason or blame their sibling. So when it comes to excuses, we need to tread gently and lightly and patiently, which is not what you'd expect when we are faced with what seem like obvious excuses from ourselves or others. We say, just do it, and assume it is as easily done as said. Well, for me, giving up my excuses worked best when it wasn't too painful to dismantle the story behind the excuse. So if the excuse was simple procrastination, the just do it was sort of effective. But I did need to shift my story to remind myself that the task wouldn't take as long as even the excuse. I could shift the story that I didn't have enough time by telling myself it was enough just to make a start on the dishes. And once I'd started, they were quickly done. On Thursday evening at choir practice, I was asked to help go over a song that isn't quite fully arranged yet. And I heard myself start to give the excuse. It wasn't ready. But since we all knew that I was giving up excuses, I had to do it anyway. And it wasn't too painful to dismantle the story that it wasn't possible to practice something that wasn't fully figured out, because it was. So this week I had some success in removing excuses related to parts of my life where I've been working already hard at the shifting of the story. Goals in my life that I had done some of the deeper work on already. However, as a first step, giving up excuses is not the place to change the deeply held stories that define us. Simply telling myself to give up excuses in those instances had no effect other than making me feel worse and worse as the week continued. If I gave up those excuses, I just exchanged them for different ones that made them even more my fault and because I'm a bad human or something. You know, in the faith tradition, Moses is given a rough time for all of the excuses he has when God appears to him in a burning bush and asks him to go and free his people from Egypt. But given my experience this week, I'm inclined to cut him a lot more slack. And so, I notice, is God. Although I'd never really noticed that in this story before. Indeed, God starts the conversation by reminding Moses that they are on holy ground, so they will need to tread lightly. And then when God asks Moses to go to the Pharaoh and have the people released from slavery, Moses' first response is to say, "Who am I to do this? I'm not qualified. I'm not someone who has any power in this context." I hear underneath that statement a question from Moses about his worth, his significance. The story he's told himself is that he's not important, he's not valuable. He doesn't matter in the story of the world or his people. And why has he told himself that? Well, remember, he grew up as an adopted kid in the palace, not really belonging there, but not belonging to his own people either. Sometimes the false story we tell ourselves protects us from feeling insignificant, that no one cares about us. I wonder if that's ever part of your story that causes you to make those excuses. If so, perhaps you might want to notice how God responds to dismantle that excuse and change Moses' story. Moses, it's not true. I care about you. You matter. I will be with you. But Moses can't accept the new story, not yet. So he brings out a different excuse. Okay, but when I get there, what am I supposed to say? I don't have any answers for those who would question me. I don't have a clue what I'm doing. Is that ever the story you tell yourself for not doing something? That you're not ready? That you don't have enough information? Well, once again, God invites Moses to see through the excuse to honesty, to shift the story. You have enough. You have the answers you need if you trust what you know. So then Moses goes deeper. He starts to offer excuses that point to his fear about how the people will respond. Well, what if they don't believe me? He's afraid of the conflict that is there ready to erupt. He's afraid of screwing it all up. He's afraid of how vulnerable going back to Egypt makes him. You see, he ran away from Egypt in the first place because he was afraid of people finding out who he was and what he had done. And going back would ask him to face that fear all over again. And God could have responded by saying what many of us say to ourselves and one another, what I kept trying to say to myself all week. Don't worry about other people. This isn't about other people. Just do it already. But God doesn't do that. God honors Moses' fear and his story by offering to back him up. God gives Moses some external authority to lean on, instead of simply relying on his inner strength. So there's a staff and a snake. And God says, don't worry, Moses, I've got you. Often I think that we should be able to rely on our own willpower to transform our story. I think that is maybe the biggest part of our story that needs dismantling. God knows we can't do this on our own. And the assurance of having backup continues because Moses has a whole bunch more excuses to bring out. I can't change. The world can't change. I'm not good enough. I'm a terrible public speaker. You could find someone better, and please, I just don't want to do it. It seems that the story Moses has told himself is that he's on his own. That hiding and avoiding responsibility is the best and perhaps only way to survive. I wonder how much that is our story so many thousands of years later. God understands that we need patience and flexibility if we're going to change these stories. In the Bible, we see God slowly pulling Moses to see through his excuses, reminding him over and over again he's not alone, reminding him that he can ask for help, that he should ask for help. For example, his brother Aaron is a great public speaker. Moses could carry the message and the mission of God, and Aaron could say the words. And so the story is dismantled. And Moses decides to try and write a new one, which doesn't mean that it's easy or that he isn't frightened, but that he is willing to make the journey of transformation. For while our excuses do help us cope with disappointment, they really don't help us much in any other way, do they? They're completely disempowering. They don't help us adapt or change our behavior. They simply allow things to remain exactly as they are. They create a story that isn't real, which means that in some ways we're not even living our real lives, or we feel like a spectator in the movie that is our life. So, having decided that simply telling ourselves to give up excuses is not the best way to change our story, what is the best first step? I don't actually have an answer to that yet. I was hoping I would before Sunday morning came around, but I don't. I suspect it's because there is no perfect first step. There's just a step and another step. And every small step might lead us backwards or forwards or up or down. But by taking the step, we are dismantling the stories that keep us stuck. And if we do it honestly, and if we do it together, we have a much better chance of getting somewhere. And because it makes us vulnerable, and because it can be painful, we need to do it carefully to help ourselves and one another write these new stories of persistence and patience and confidence and hope. So instead of tapping into the story of failure by asking our kids why they didn't walk the dog, we might help them think of ways that they can be kinder to the dog as the caring and responsible pet owners they want to be. Instead of berating ourselves in the story of it's impossible, as we eat another piece of cake or smoke another cigarette, asking ourselves how we can be more compassionate with ourselves, how we can ask for help to be the whole and healthy people we long to be. It may be that for me, giving up excuses was indeed a fine starting place. As long as the first story that I start to dismantle is the idea that that's the end. My, what a journey Lent can be. Thank God we are not alone.